All right, good morning, everybody. As I said earlier, this is our adult ed session. Welcome on this All Saints Day. Bruce Douglas has very kindly agreed to speak with us for the next 3 weeks on the topic of race and religion and the history of American Presbyterianism. And although you all know Bruce very well, for those of you who don't, that he was a professor of government, or is currently, I guess, an emeritus professor of government at Georgetown, and was the director of the Reformed Institute of Metropolitan Washington for, 15 years, I think, from 2003 to 2018. So he comes to us with all that experience. He's going to be speaking, as I said, about race and religion, and specifically the history of American Presbyterianism. I'm going to turn things over to Bruce, and he's going to lead us in what I know will be a fascinating discussion.
Thank you very much. I indicated to our convener that I have been dealing with a cold for the last several days, so I hope that will not affect my voice too much, and I hope occasionally you'll tolerate it if I cough, but I think I'm pretty well through that problem, and I'm happy to be able to share these thoughts with you this morning. The topic I've chosen to talk about in this series of 3 talks is broader, and I want to acknowledge this at the outset, than I am able to do justice to. Race and religion in American Presbyterian history covers more than just black-white relations. There's a very important chapter having to do with Native Americans. I will not be dealing with that. There's another important chapter having to do with Asian Americans. I will not be dealing with that, etc. There are a whole series of other chapters that could be drawn into this, but I hope for obvious reasons I want to focus on black-white relations. I'm going to be focusing mainly on the history of this topic with regard to the mainline denominations. Presbyterians have in their history in this country a whole series of splinter denominations. I'll refer to them a bit, especially toward the end of my remarks when I get around to talking about divisions that have developed in our own time with regard to this topic. But for the most part, I'm going to be talking about what might be characterized as mainline, large, more influential Presbyterian churches in both the North and the South. The other thing I'm going to be doing in this presentation, which is a little bit distinctive, not totally, but somewhat distinctive, is to emphasize the views of both black and white Presbyterians. We live in to state the obvious, a predominantly white denomination, overwhelmingly white denomination. But there have been all along, at least since the 18th century, black Presbyterians. They have had views on the issues I'll be discussing, and their views actually are very important to take into account in thinking about the evolution of this problem, this topic, among American Presbyterians. I'm going to be talking about this topic, as you know, in 3 chapters, 3 different segments. The first has to do with slavery, the period of slavery in the British colonies, which became then the American nation. Second, I will be talking about the successor, and I think that's the appropriate way to think about it, to slavery, which is segregation, a whole set of institutions and practices that developed particularly around the 1890s and after into roughly the 1950s. That's the era of segregation in American life. And then finally, a chapter which is still unfolding, but I'll be indicating starts in the late 1950s and extends to the present, the era of desegregation. So slavery today, segregation next week, and then finally desegregation the following week. The breakdown of this talk is in 3 parts. I'll be talking briefly about who the Presbyterians were in the time of slavery. I have talked about that topic many times before at the meeting house. I'm under no illusions about you remembering everything I said, maybe much of what I said. So let me just repeat a few basic things about the origins of American Presbyterianism in the colonial period and on into the time of the Civil War. Secondly, I'll be saying just a few things things that many of you may know about the institution of slavery and its place in American life. And then finally, the largest part of my remarks will be devoted to a summary characterization of Presbyterian attitudes toward this terribly important institution of slavery. First, who are the Presbyterians? The Presbyterian history in the United States, in the colonies, and then in the United States, is a phenomenon of the 18th century. There was, of course, colonization on these shores well before that in the 17th century, but it's in the 1700s that Presbyterians really begin to emerge as an identifiable ecclesiastical strain in American Christianity. I'll give you a couple of, I'll give you 3 dates to sort of hang the remarks I'm going to be making about this topic on. The first presbytery was created in 1706. The first synod, which was a combination of 3 presbyteries, was created in 1716. And the first General Assembly of a new national church, an independent national church, which up to that point did not exist, was in 1789. So the origins of American Presbyterianism, 1706, 1716, and then later 1789. And by the way, by the time that General Assembly met, there were several synods and a whole slew of presbyteries. So there was an elaborate infrastructure of American Presbyterians built up before the independent American, the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America appeared. Very important thing to note about Presbyterians is that they were initially a phenomenon of the middle colonies, not the South, not the North, but the middle colonies. New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Southern New York. That's where the Presbyterians were located initially. New England, hardly any roots in New England, and initially not much in the South, which was dominated by Anglicans and a few Baptists. But very quickly, especially over the course of the 18th century, the 1700s, they spread out from the middle colonies, which was their sort of base of operation, Philadelphia being the center of it, out into the West, which was as far west as Pittsburgh, and then down the Shenandoah into North Carolina and South Carolina, Kentucky, of course, being somewhat a part of that as well. So think of them as having their base of operations in the middle colonies, and then extending out as more and more immigrants came into the West and the South. They were mostly initially of immigrant stock. There were a few native-born Presbyterians who migrated from New England, dissident Puritans who migrated down into the southern, from their point of view, the farther south into the middle colonies. But for the most part, the Presbyterians were immigrants who came from 3 places: England, Scotland, and a terribly important part of the story, Northern Ireland, the Ulster Presbyterians, or more commonly known as the Scots-Irish. And my guess is that at a place like the Meeting House, you've got a lot of people who come from that stock, Scots-Irish stock. They were overwhelmingly middle class, very important thing to note. In the middle colonies, actually, and even beyond, there was a lot of class consciousness. I sometimes think of Americans today don't appreciate the extent to which in the time of the colonization of this country, there was a lot of really sharp distinctions being drawn, ultimately to be blurred in important ways, about class. A lot of them came, the colonists came after all from England, which was terribly class conscious. Presbyterians overwhelmingly were not upper class. The Anglicans were upper class. Even the Anglicans who had strong Republican beliefs were upper class. The Anglicans were identified, of course, with the whole idea of an established church. Presbyterians were not lower class either. Very few of them were laborers, for example. So what were they? In professions, they were, in the professions, of course, law, medicine, education, the clergy. Secondly, farming. And thirdly, commerce. That was the heart of the Presbyterian base, if you will. People who lived and carried out their work in those fields. They tended to be enterprising people in a number of different senses, had a real strong sense of being go-getters, and at the same time, they were very strongly committed to education. That's been one of their historic defining features. So education, enterprising people, and as a result of their enterprising ability, especially in this new land, many of them were very successful in economic terms. And so over time, as the 18th century went on, they got richer and richer. Several of them, not all of them, but many of them made fortunes. And that relates, of course, especially in the South, to their relationship to the institution of slavery. Because of a huge influx of Scots-Irish immigrants in the period between the 17-teens and 1760s and 70s, they became a political force of some consequence. They were politically influential, especially at the time of the struggle for independence. And they were identified by the British as a almost unambiguously pro-independence force. It's a very important thing to note about them. Now, you can't say unequivocally all Presbyterians were on the side of independence, but the vast majority were. And that's how they came to be thought of, as the people who were dedicated to seeking independence. The vast majority of these people in the 18th century, but not all, were white. Let me say that again. The vast majority were white, but not all. There were in the 1700s Black Presbyterians. I'll come to the reasons for that in a moment, but it's a very important part of the story that I'm going to be telling here, that as early as even before the founding of the American Republic, there were people who had been evangelized and began to think of themselves as Presbyterians, as Protestant Christians of a certain type, of people who came to identify with. And even in the early 1800s, there were Black Presbyterian churches. Now, the interesting question, of course, is why did Blacks in the early 1800s feel a need to create Black Presbyterian churches? I'll come back and talk about that. Those churches were in the North, places like New York and Philadelphia and so forth. But there is clear record of their existence, partly because we know the names of some of their most distinguished clergy. Some Presbyterians, and over time, more Presbyterians had slaves, but the vast majority, as far as I can make out, did not. I want to stress that. Some Presbyterians had slaves, and some had large numbers of slaves, especially in the South, as they moved into plantation economies, as the whole country moved in the direction of plantation economies. There were more and more Presbyterians who owned not just one slave, the house slave, if you will, but large numbers of slaves. Final thing I want to say about Presbyterians is that in this period, partly I think this is the reason for their strong identification with the cause of national independence. They never were an established church. I'm using the term established in the technical sense here, as the Church of England or the Church of Scotland, the established church of the nation. Now, of course, in parts of the British colonies, there were the established church, Congregational Church in New England, Anglicans in much of the rest of the colonies. That put the Presbyterians and the Baptists in particular at a disadvantage. And they resented it, and they disliked it, and they disliked the power that gave the Anglicans to be able to dictate the terms on which they conducted ministry. All right, that's a quick overview of the Presbyterians in this period. Now let me turn to the institution of slavery. I think one of the most important things to note about the Presbyterians and their relationship to the institution of slavery is this. Slavery existed as a well-established institution before there was anything like American Presbyterianism. Let me say that again. Slavery existed in these colonies as a well-established institution long before there was anything like American Presbyterianism. Now, in order for there to be presbyteries, starting in 1706, you had to have individual Presbyterian churches, and there were a few in the 1600s, but not many. The real growth in Presbyterian churches was in the 1700s. Now, we know now, people have known it for a long time, but it's now more a matter of common knowledge that slavery existed on these shores for a long time before that happened. This is one of the great virtues of the New York Times 1619 project. The very identification of that date reminds us that there were slaves and an institution of slavery from the early 1600s on in the colonization of North America. So from at least the 1620s on, there were established institutions, there were laws and practices which clearly made slavery a given institution. And therefore, by the time there was American Presbyterianism, it was taken for granted. It was part of the way of life of these people. I think that's a very important thing just to ponder for a moment. It's one thing to be present at the inception of an institution. It's another thing to confront an institution which is already woven into the fabric of life. Now, there were parts of the fabric of life that the Presbyterians confronted in the 1700s that they didn't like at all, and they actively resisted. But I want to stress, slavery was not one of them. Slavery was not one of them. They disliked profoundly, as time went by, the institution of the monarchy. They disliked profoundly the class structure that went with it. But when it came to slavery, and it's a very interesting thing to sort of differentiate those two things, when it came to slavery, their attitudes were more ambivalent. The institution of slavery in the colonies took many different forms. And I don't want to, given the short amount of time I've got here, I don't want to belabor this, but let me just say, the Black population was treated differently than the Native American population, for example. The Native American population was oftentimes enslaved by white colonists, but that was typically justified on grounds of the fact that they were taken as prisoners in war, which was a historic justification of the institution of slavery. It was very common, going all the way back to ancient times, to say that it was legitimate to enslave people that you had defeated in a military conflict. There was a tendency to say when Native Americans were enslaved that that was justified on those grounds, which is a very different thing from the kind of justification that developed with respect to the enslavement of Blacks. The enslavement of Negroes, and that was the more common term that was used at that time, the enslavement of Negroes was a very specific kind of slavery, and frankly, it was, I think historians would agree, the worst kind. It was chattel slavery, which meant that the Negroes were enslaved in a form that made them, in effect, simply property. Property like you would treat an animal, a beast of burden. And it was justified in those terms as an economic resource, property to be used as an economic resource. It started small, the institution of slavery in North America, in the British colonies, but quickly grew and expanded dramatically. The numbers grew dramatically over time, especially in the 18th century. By the 1860s, there were several million slaves. The estimate that I've seen that is, as far as I can tell, the most reliable one is at least 4 million slaves existed at the time of the Civil War, most of them in the South. And if you ask a question about why the institution of slavery existed and grew in that way, that's a very important part of it. Think of it as growth, kind of growth industry. in the period after the founding of the Republic. You can have a lot of complicated discussions, but it seems to me the answer to that is relatively simple. It was economically advantageous. It was profoundly economically advantageous for the following reason. The moment it became evident that the American South was a very likely that it was going to be possible in the American South to grow certain crops that were best grown on plantations, then the institution of slavery really begins to make economic sense. Those crops include tobacco, sugar, rice, and of course, the one that's most common in our minds, cotton. And when it became evident, as it did in the 18th century, that fortunes, huge fortunes, were to be made by large production of those crops, then you have a kind of natural incentive, not only for expanding slavery, but holding on to it for dear life, like it's the obvious right thing to do. Now let me turn to Presbyterian attitudes, which is my main theme for this particular presentation. In subsequent talks, I will make an elaborate distinction between white attitudes and black attitudes. And let me say, in speaking about black attitudes, it's very clear by the 18th century, because you've got black leaders, church leaders, distinguished clergy, who were emerging in that black Presbyterian world, in some of those black Presbyterian churches, that at least insofar as they can be taken as spokespersons for the black point of view, the black view is absolutely clear on this topic. Slavery is an abomination, full stop. They all said that. And one of the more interesting themes that I'm going to be developing as I go along in these talks is oftentimes the black view was clear and just very, very sharply posed and without any ambiguity. And the white ability to have complexity in their thinking about it was in considerable measure a result of a refusal to take the blacks very serious, a refusal to take into account their views. It's a really interesting study. All the way along, the black views tend to be rather sharp and focused, and then you've got all kinds of white complexity. So on this topic, I will say simply, and not develop it in any great detail, unlike subsequent presentations. The black voice was, this is an abomination, and let me be more precise about it. It is an abomination in the eyes of God. It is contrary to the will of God, and it needs to stop. Black leaders in the Presbyterian world tended to be abolitionists. They tended to be abolitionists, and they tended to be spokespersons for the abolitionist cause outside of their church work. They founded newspapers. They organized what we today would call them interest groups or pressure groups designed to seek this goal of the elimination of slavery. And by the way, most of the black Presbyterians were in the North, of course. Most of the black Presbyterians were not only they were free blacks, but they came from families in which there had been some freedom for blacks. Now, with regard to whites, that's where the story is complicated, and I have to be long-winded in order to begin to do justice to it. I want to say two things about white views and then 16 qualifications. The main thing I want to say about it is this. It seems to me there was in white attitudes towards slavery in terms of actual practice, what people did. It's so interesting to distinguish, to focus on a General Assembly pronouncement. And one gets the feeling a General Assembly pronouncement helps to clarify, but only somewhat, because you need to look at what goes on in the pew, or what goes on in the lives of the people who are in the pew. And if you look at the lives of Presbyterians in this period, it seems to me the vast majority of Presbyterians were, to some degree, accepting of the institution of slavery. Let me say that again. the vast majority of white Presbyterians, excuse me, were accepting of the institution of slavery. Another way to put this is to say the following. Among white Presbyterians, there was a broad spectrum of views on the legitimacy, the morality of the institution of slavery as they experienced it with respect to Blacks. Broad spectrum of possibilities, but most Presbyterians were somewhere in the middle. Now let me define that spectrum. At one end were white Presbyterians who were themselves abolitionists. I want to say that as clearly as I can. There were Black and there were prominent white Presbyterians who were abolitionists. The most notable one is Benjamin Rush, who was a physician from Pennsylvania, a very important figure in the struggle for American independence. But there were others. Benjamin Rush was a kind of eloquent voice on behalf of the cause of abolition. Said similar things to what I've already indicated was the Black position on this topic. That is, he said, and of course, for Protestants, there is a tendency, unlike Roman Catholics, for example, to conduct discussions of this kind almost entirely in biblical terms, at least to frame the argument almost entirely in biblical terms. He said, I simply cannot find the justification for slavery in the Bible. And I think it's unscriptural, and it's something that we need as much as possible to eliminate as quickly as possible. Now, the fact that he was one of the founding fathers, that he was one of the people who was involved in the drafting of the Declaration of Independence will give you some sense as to a very important point I want to make. Occasionally you hear people say, well, back in the day, they didn't know, or they really weren't very clear about the problem, the moral problem, the spiritual problem with slavery. Nonsense, particularly in this age, particularly starting once there was a struggle for independence. There was clear awareness among American elites, and I would include Presbyterians among them, among American elites, that this was a deeply problematic institution. Abolitionists, in the pure sense, were people who said, this is just wrong, full stop, and it's a blot on our nation, our emerging new nation, to have it, and we got to get rid of it as soon as possible. Some of those people even were tempted to weave that kind of thinking into the founding documents. And of course, if they'd done that, there would have been no United States of America. Let me say that again. If they'd done that, there would have been no United States of America, because the division, even at that point, among the defenders of slavery and the proponent and the critics of slavery was so strong that probably the coming together that was necessary of those colonies to become states would have been impossible, and there would have been multiple nations. So you had abolitionists on the one end, and then at the other end of the spectrum, and this is not going to be newsflash to anybody at the meeting house, there were people who were just as firmly convinced and eloquent in their own way, saying, no, slavery is of God. Slavery is the will of God. Slavery is the will of God, and furthermore, it is biblical. We can cite all kinds of texts and there are all kinds of resources in the Bible for defending this institution. And therefore, the last thing we would want to do is to challenge it, let alone get rid of it. This is something which God willed, and there are all kinds of, we can get into, if you like, in the Q&A about what kinds of arguments can be made for that. By the way, let me just say parenthetically, Mark Knoll, whose a wonderful book, America's God, is a big, long, thick book on this topic, where he goes through the whole set of arguments about the legitimacy of slavery. And his point of view is that if you have anything like a literalist reading of scripture, he calls it common sense literalism. If you have anything like a common sense literalist reading of scripture, as so many of these people did, who were defenders of slavery, then the argument for slavery is fairly strong as a matter of biblical interpretation. At any rate, you had defenders of slavery and you had critics of slavery at these extremes. And then you had all kinds of positions in between those. Let me give you a couple of them, just so you'll get a sense of the spectrum. And the reason I'm going into this in this detail is because I'm trying to give you a sense of what it was like to go to a Presbyterian meeting. To go to a Presbyterian meeting in the 1780s or the 1790s or the early 19th century, there was intense debate about this issue. I've oftentimes thought it would have been fascinating to be just part of those conversations. And by the way, anybody who thinks that sort of politics has not had much to do with the church's life needs to have some sense of that debate, because it was just a central part of the church's life. One moderating position, sort of a step away from abolitionism towards the center, would be this. Yes, slavery is a bad thing. Yes, we think slavery is not God's will. But now that we've got slavery, we can't just do away with it. We have to be very careful, be very gradual in the approach that we take to dismantling it. I hope you sense the difference there. Not eliminate it now. Good Lord, if we eliminate it now, we'll reap the whirlwind. We've got to be very careful. Somewhere down the road, I'll get to what is implied in that in a moment. At the other end of the spectrum, if you were not, shall we say, a fierce proponent of slavery, you might have said something like the following. Well, not literally, that is slavery the will of God? That is something that God intended. But we might infer from certain biblical passages the following: that while slavery is not something God intended, you might say, in the very design of the universe, what God did do is introduce slavery as a remedy for sin, as a remedy for certain evils that are existent in the world. It is believe it or not, an institution which somehow is like so many others. This was oftentimes an interpretation of the state, the coercive power of the state. The coercive power of the state is not an ideal thing, but it's necessary in the world, and God put it there in order to control the amount of evil that goes on. Well, and here's the kicker: some people need to be enslaved. Some people need to be enslaved in order to prevent there from being mayhem in the world. Now, those are, if you will, I've identified 4 positions. And if this were a class of 13 weeks, we would probably identify 6 or 8 positions. But take my word for it, the debate got very fine-tuned as people went along. Having said all that, let me now identify something which is important to add as a kind of very important, as a complement to what I've just said. Even though Presbyterians, white Presbyterians, debated the institution of slavery intensely in this period, they agreed on certain things. And here are the things they agreed upon. And these things they agreed upon were not necessarily accepted by the wider population. These are, shall we say, somewhat distinctive Presbyterian premises in approaching the discussion of slavery. I'm going to mention 4 things. 1, these slaves, these Africans, they are human beings. They are fully human beings. You might say, well, why would that be an issue? Believe you me, it was an issue in that period. There were a lot of people who said, these are not fully human beings. These are half animals. Very important issue in thinking about the morality of the institution of slavery. Second, and in saying that they are human beings, there were 2 things that were intended, which are very important to underscore and distinguish. These are human beings created in the image of God. That Black person who is your slave is created in the image of God. And therefore, it is not only appropriate, but necessary that we think of that Black person as an appropriate subject of evangelization. They have souls which need to be saved. They need to hear the gospel. They need to be converted. Later in the development of the Confederacy in particular, the whole issue of evangelization of slaves becomes a very contested issue. A third thing that they also believed was the following. And this is, you might say, utterly, unmistakably Protestant, and Reformed people in particular. It's a kind of natural instinct once you've granted the premises that I have laid out. These are people who have minds, and therefore they are capable of reading and writing. And if they're going to be evangelized, they have to be enabled to learn to read and write, because they have to have access to Scripture. In the time of the Confederacy, throughout much of the Confederacy, it was forbidden to teach slaves to read and write. And I hope you see why. It's an explosive proposition. And finally, a very important part of this, it is essential, if we're going to evangelize these people and if we're going to teach them to read and write and give them access to Scripture, it is also, of course, important that they have, on an ongoing basis, access to corporate worship. Access to corporate worship of our kind. And so, very important thing to point to note here in this period, unlike what comes later in segregation, it was taken for granted by Presbyterians that slaves should be present at public worship. Now, maybe they're going to be, not maybe, certainly they're going to be in the balcony or out on the lawn, but they are going to worship with the whites. And a very interesting question arises, well, when it comes to the Lord's Supper, do they get access to? Of course they get access to the Lord's Supper. All of that is the foundation of what goes on in this long period, not only of slavery, but also of segregation. One very interesting thing to note about the discussion of slavery, given all the things I've just said, is the following. If you assume the things that I've just said, how could you possibly be a defender of slavery? I've already given this talk a couple of times in other churches, and that immediately arises. If you grant all the things I've just said, how could you possibly defend the institute? Answer is the following. Well, these are inferior people, even if they are human beings. They are inferior people, and even if they are it's entirely appropriate for us to evangelize them and teach them to read and write and so forth. They, in the will of God, in the mind of God, are destined to play a subordinate role, and it is good for them to be able to be subjected to the rule of whites who have themselves heard and accepted the gospel. Now I come to the final chapter of what I want to say. That's the world, the intellectual world these people inhabited as they debated the institution of slavery in moral and spiritual terms. It's very interesting to me to note that in the period from the 1780s on, you have repeated pronouncements by synods and eventually the General Assembly of the church, many presbyteries as well, many statements which sound very much like abolitionist statements. Let me say that again. Many statements adopted, presumably, by the commissioners to presbytery, commissioners to synod, commissioners to General Assembly. A majority of people adopt these pronouncements which say different variations on the following. We as a church believe that it is not right for human beings to own and exploit other human beings in the way that slavery entails. And therefore, we appeal to our fellow citizens, and we are dedicating ourselves to actively working for the abolition of this institution. And of course, even more specifically, and we appeal to our fellow Presbyterians to take necessary measures to ensure that they do not support the institution of slavery. You get pronouncements like that, I would say, in a sort of steady drum beat from the 1780s all the way up through the 18 teens and even 1820s, 1780s through the 1820s. Not so much after that. I'll get to that in just a second. Now, what that suggests is the following. I don't think any other conclusion that can be drawn than this. In that period, even though there was a variety of different views, shall we say, the people with abolitionist tendencies got the upper hand in Presbyterian adjudicatories. Let me say that again. The people who were opposed to slavery, who were opposed to the institution of slavery, got the upper hand in the discussion of that institution. Very interesting. I'm sure there were many people who who were themselves commissioners to these judicatories who disagreed with that. I'm convinced, I'm certain that there were many, many people who were in the pew who disagreed with this. Nonetheless, that's what happened. Now, the thing that also needs to be observed, however, is the following. And here I want to draw a distinction between Presbyterians and Quakers. These statements, and historians have really documented pretty well the frequency with which they happened. They didn't happen, by the way, in all the Presbyterians. They didn't happen in all the parts of the country. Predictably, they were much more common, especially at the Synod and Presbytery level in the North and even the West than the South. Nonetheless, there's a pattern of them that's enough that you can say almost a trend. But there was something about them that's so interesting, and so I think it sort of touches upon an issue which has far greater reach than just the issue of slavery. Many of the strong abolitionists said the following: we need to, as much as possible, weave this commitment we have to the elimination of slavery into the disciplinary procedures of our church. Let me say that again, the disciplinary procedures of our church. So as to, for example, deny ordination or even to defrock a clergy person who owned slaves. Let me say that again, deny ordination or defrock somebody who is a clergy person. And by the way, the estimate is that by the time of the Civil War, at least a third of Presbyterian clergy themselves owned slaves. So if you did that, that would be a very sharp and severe discipline to the other side. Some others said it would be entirely appropriate to deny access to leadership positions on the part of lay people in the Presbyterian Church if they themselves were involved in perpetuating the institution of slavery. You can imagine somebody not being allowed to serve as a member of session, or a commissioner to Presbytery, a commissioner to the General Assembly, because of their implication in the institution of slavery. For example, they own slaves and they refuse to take steps to free them. There are all kinds of proposals like that out there. On the whole, however, the trend was for those things to be, quote, left to the jurisdiction of each individual presbytery, to make this a matter of local rule. In other words, there was a very strong resistance on the part of, shall we say, probably the majority of people, I'm guessing, to actual measures of enforcement, which would make it very difficult to be a part of the life of this church, this particular church, if you were not actively supportive of the abolition cause. And as a result, with very few exceptions, these proclamations, which were made all the time, had very little in the way of teeth in them. They were general proclamations which had very little effect in terms of actual enforcement. And when they were drawn in the direction of enforcement, they typically led to schism. They typically led to church splits. I mentioned the Quakers. I just want to briefly note that. When you look at the history of the Quakers, and this is so interesting because we think of the Quakers as a very ironic body of people, but they were much more, being strongly abolitionist, although there were, of course, Quakers who owned slaves. We know that now. But the Quakers tended to be much more convinced that it was appropriate to exclude people who refused to support this cause. And so we have records of Quakers who were owners of slaves who refused to heed the admonitions of their of their religious community to repent of that sin. That was the phrase that was used, to repent of that sin and take measures which would be evidence of repentance of that sin. They eventually found it so uncomfortable to be part of the Quaker community that they migrated to typically the Anglican Church. So you have an interesting contrast there. Presbyterians, in some respects, in terms of public pronouncements, for a time being very, very strongly abolitionist in at least much of the church, and yet ultimately drawing back from imposing that in any kind of homogeneous way on the church. And when they tried to do so, as developed in the period of the 1840s and 50s, it led to schism. And of course, eventually it led to the big schism, which was the schism which came with the creation of the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States in 1861. And by the way, once that schism was created, that's the biggest schism of all in American Presbyterianism, the creation of Southern Presbyterianism. Once it was created, it persisted all the way up to the 1980s. So from the 1860s all the way to the 1980s, there was a division, and it was rooted in the struggle over slavery. Final thing I want to say is the following. Running through all of these discussions is a very interesting phenomenon which surfaces rather clearly at times. Why were people so nervous about the institution, attacks on the institution of slavery, as clearly was the case? Got people's juices going. Well, of course, in the first instance, it was that many people, but not all people, had an economic interest in the institution. But I want to suggest to you it's more complicated than just that. Why was there resistance to moving more aggressively toward, in the period I'm talking about, before the Civil War, moving to dismantle this institution? It's interesting to note, and I think this is rather clear among white Presbyterians, that even though they were committed to, as so many of them were, to the idea of, in principle, slavery being a bad thing and some way it's got to be eliminated, their minds were, the issue was complicated in their minds by fear. And this is the fear. What's going to happen if we emancipate those slaves? What's going to happen? Now, that fear was most acute in the South for obvious reasons. Keep in mind that at the time of the outbreak of the Civil War, 80% of the slaves were illiterate. So you got this illiterate population. And if people think about, well, the emancipation of them, what's going to happen here? Even though Presbyterians were committed to all the things I've talked about, the actualization of the promise of the idea of an educated Black population was far in the distance. So when you got, most of them who are illiterate and poor and on, what happens if they are liberated? What are they going to do? What are they going to do to us, etc.? Even in the North, there was a fear of that kind. One way of dealing with that fear was the following. This is my last comment for the morning, at least in this form. Many American white Presbyterians said, well, clearly the answer to this problem is to ship them all back to Africa. And thus, in the period of the great struggle over abolition, the most common view of white Presbyterians who were opposed to the institution of slavery was colonization of Africa. We need, and there's something called the American Colonization Society, to which many white Presbyterians devoted time and energy. They thought that is the answer to the problem of emancipation. That once they are emancipated, we will very quickly figure out ways to, as much as possible, enable them to migrate back to Africa. And then they would say something like, and they can evangelize Africa. Won't that be wonderful? But I want to suggest to you what was driving that was this fear of what would happen in a, you might say, really free society in which slaves were allowed to do what they wanted to do. Former slaves were allowed to do what they wanted to do on their own. Let me stop there and hopefully be able to answer a couple of questions.
Bruce, thank you. Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. We really appreciated your thoughtful thought form, taking us through that really complicated piece of that difficult story.